The whistle that used to wake me every morning at 5:47 a.m. hasn't blown through Shelby in near 15 years now, but my bones still remember the sound. Walter Jennings? That's me. Walt to folks who matter, and at 82, I reckon I've heard more train whistles than most men hear church bells in a lifetime. 43 years I worked for Norfolk Southern, back when it was still Southern Railway, and before that when it was just the Carolina and Northwestern line that ran through these North Carolina foothills like God's own highway. Tonight, I'm setting 3 plates at my kitchen table instead of the usual one. Cheryl's coming for Sunday dinner with her family. My daughter, her husband Frank, and little Lily, though she ain't so little anymore at 17. The ham's been cooking since this morning, slow and steady like everything worth doing right. I learned that lesson on the railroad: rushing gets you derailed, patience keeps you on track. My house on Lineberger Street isn't much to look at from the outside, just a modest ranch-style place I bought in 1967 when the railroad was paying good and Shelby was still a railroad town. But it's mine, paid for with collie-used hands and 30 years of mortgage payments that never missed a month. The walls hold 43 years of shift schedules, overtime paychecks, and the kind of steady work that built this country before folks started chasing office jobs and computer screens. Cheryl shows up 20 minutes late, which has become her way. Frank follows behind carrying a bottle of wine that probably costs more than my weekly groceries, and Lily brings up the rear with that careful walk teenagers use when they're trying not to upset anybody. She's got her grandmother's eyes, my late wife Margaret's eyes, sharp and kind at the same time. "Hey there, Dad," Cheryl says, giving me one of those quick hugs that don't mean much. She's wearing her nurse administrator clothes even on Sunday, all starched and official-like. House smells good. Frank shakes my hand with that real estate agent grip of his, firm and practiced. "Walt, good to see you. How's retirement treating you?" "Can't complain," I tell him, though I could. Retirement's lonelier than a midnight freight run through the mountains. Y'all sit down, ham's ready. During dinner, they talk about their jobs, their mortgage, Lily's senior year at Shelby High. I listen mostly, like I learned to do during all those union meetings where the loud talkers usually had the least sense. Cheryl mentions how expensive everything's getting: healthcare, the house payment, Lily's college applications coming up. "I don't know how we're going to manage it all, Dad," she says, cutting her ham into perfect little squares like she did when she was 8. "Frank's real estate market has been slow, and my salary at the hospital, well, you know how it is." I nod and keep eating. What I don't mention is the 3 rental properties I own on the south side of town. Little houses I bought and fixed up over the years when the railroad was paying overtime, and Margaret was still alive to help with the business side of things. Cheryl doesn't know about those houses, or about the $980,000 sitting in retirement accounts that 43 years of railroad work will accumulate if you live simple and invest steady. She's never asked about my finances, and I've never volunteered the information. After dinner, Frank makes excuses about having to show a house early Monday morning, and Cheryl needs to prep for some hospital board meeting. But Lily stays behind to help with dishes, like she always does. She's the only one who seems to actually see me as more than just old furniture that happens to cook Sunday dinner. "Grandpa Walt," she says while we're washing plates, "tell me about the trains again. About that wreck you helped clear in '78. So I do, because somebody ought to remember these stories, and she's the only one who listens like they matter. I tell her about the derailment outside Gastonia, how we worked 18 straight hours getting that freight line cleared, how teamwork and knowing your job could save lives and livelihoods. "You were important, weren't you?" she says, and there's something in her voice that makes me look at her closer. I mean, really important, not just somebody's dad or grandpa. Every man's important at what he does best, honey. The trick is knowing what that is. She dries the last plate real careful, then looks around to make sure her parents are really gone. "Grandpa, I need you to promise me something." "What's that?" Her voice drops to almost a whisper, and those Margaret eyes get serious as a heart attack. "Promise me you'll never sign anything without me looking at it first." 3 weeks after that Sunday dinner, Cheryl called me on a Tuesday morning while I was having my coffee and reading the Shelby Star. She had that tone in her voice, the one she used to use when she was 16 and needed something but didn't want to ask directly. Dad, Frank and I have been talking, and we think it might be good for all of us if we moved in with you for a while. Just temporarily, you understand. We're downsizing anyway, and with the real estate market being what it is, I set down my coffee cup and watched a freight train that doesn't exist anymore roll through my mind's eye. Moved in here? All three of you? It makes sense, Dad. You're getting older, living alone in that big house. We could help with maintenance, cooking, keeping you company. And frankly, it would help us save some money while the market recovers. What she called a big house was 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. Nothing fancy, but it was mine, and it held 43 years of memories with Margaret. Still, Cheryl was my daughter, and family helps family. That's how I was raised back when people stayed in the same town their whole lives and looked after their own. Well, I reckon we could try it, I said. They moved in the following Saturday. Frank drove up in a U-Haul truck that seemed too big for temporary downsizing, and they brought furniture, boxes, and an attitude of permanence that made my stomach feel like I'd swallowed railroad gravel. Within 2 hours, they'd rearranged my living room and kitchen to make better use of the space. Dad, we're putting you in the guest room, Cheryl announced while directing Frank where to put their new bedroom set in what used to be my and Margaret's room. It's smaller, easier for you to manage, less walking around at night. The guest room was where Margaret used to sew, where I'd set up a little desk to do paperwork for my rental properties. Now it held a single bed and a dresser that belonged to my grandmother. My clothes got moved into one small closet, my personal papers boxed up for safekeeping. Where are you putting my desk? I asked Frank as he carried it toward the garage. Cheryl thought you didn't really need it anymore. We can set up a card table in the living room if you need to write checks or anything. That first week, I felt like a stranger in my own house. Frank rearranged my tools in the garage. Cheryl reorganized my kitchen cabinets, and they installed a new cable package with channels I'd never watch. Lily tried to make it normal, sitting with me after school, but even she seemed uncomfortable with how quickly everything had changed. This is temporary, right, Grandpa? She asked one afternoon while her parents were out. That's what they said, honey. But I'd worked on railroads long enough to know when something was heading in the wrong direction. The signs were all there if you knew how to read them. The real wake-up call came on a Thursday evening when Frank sat me down at my own kitchen table with a manila folder full of papers. He'd put on his serious face, the one he probably used when explaining mortgage terms to first-time homebuyers. Walt, Cheryl and I have been thinking about your situation here. You're 82, living on a fixed income, and this house is a lot of responsibility. We think it might be time to start restructuring your assets for your own protection. My assets are fine where they are. I said, but are they really? Do you have everything properly organized? Legal protections in place? What happens if you get sick and need long-term care? Have you thought about Medicaid spend-downs, asset protection strategies? He talked for 20 minutes, using words that sounded official and caring but felt like sandpaper on my nerves. Estate planning, financial security, family responsibility, legal protection. It all sounded reasonable, the way a train whistle sounds normal until you realize it's coming from the wrong direction. That night, I lay in what used to be Margaret's sewing room and stared at the ceiling. Through the thin walls, I could hear Frank and Cheryl talking in low voices in their room. My room, I couldn't make out words, but the tone was the same one supervisors used when they were planning layoffs back at the railroad yard. The next morning, Lily knocked on my door before school. When I opened it, she looked around nervous-like, then stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Grandpa, I found some papers in Dad's briefcase last night. Her voice was barely a whisper. Papers with your name on them. Something about power of attorney. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The same feeling I used to get when I saw storm clouds building up ahead of a long freight run. What kind of papers? I don't know exactly, but they looked official, like forms already filled out, just waiting for signatures. She grabbed my hand. Grandpa, I don't think they're planning to move out. That afternoon, Frank came home early with news that made my blood run cold as winter rails. Walt, good news. I've scheduled an appointment for you with a lawyer on Monday. Time to get all your affairs properly organized. Family protection, you understand. Monday morning came gray and cold, the kind of weather that used to make railroad switches freeze up and cause all sorts of trouble down the line. Frank drove me to the lawyer's office in his spotless Buick, making small talk about the weather and Lily's college applications like we were heading to Sunday service, instead of what felt more and more like my own funeral arrangements. The lawyer's office was in one of those new buildings out by the mall, all glass and fake marble that looked expensive, but felt hollow. Frank had picked an attorney named Mitchell Barnes, a young fellow maybe 40 years old with soft hands and a smile that reminded me of used car salesmen I'd learned not to trust back when I was buying work trucks for my rental properties. "Mr. Jennings," Barnes said, shaking my hand across a desk bigger than my kitchen table. "Frank's told me all about your situation. It's smart thinking, getting your estate organized at your age." For the next hour, Barnes talked about power of attorney documents, healthcare directives, and asset protection strategies. Frank nodded along like he'd heard it all before, which maybe he had. The papers were already drawn up, neat and official, with little yellow sticky tabs marking where I was supposed to sign. "Now this power of attorney gives Cheryl authority to handle your financial affairs," Barnes explained, pointing to a thick document. "Banking, real estate transactions, investment decisions. It's really for your own protection, Mr. Jennings. As we get older, these decisions become more complex. I'd been reading contracts and legal papers for 43 years, union agreements, property deeds, insurance policies. A railroad engineer learns to read the fine print because one missed detail can derail more than just trains. This power of attorney wasn't limited or temporary like Barnes was making it sound. It was comprehensive and immediate, giving Cheryl control over everything I owned the moment I signed. "What's the rush?" I asked. "These decisions have waited 82 years. They can wait a few more days." Frank shifted in his chair. "Dad, we're just trying to help you avoid problems down the road." But something bothered me about this Barnes fellow. He kept looking at Frank when he talked, not at me. And when I asked questions about specific clauses, he gave answers that sounded rehearsed, like he was reading from a script. "Mr. Barnes," I said finally, "what's your father's name?" He looked surprised. "My father? William Barnes." "Why do you ask?" "Bill Barnes." I thought so. "He used to work at First National Bank, didn't he? Before it became BB&T?" "Yes, sir. He was a loan officer there for 30 years. Helped me get the mortgage on my rental properties back in the 80s. Good man, your father. Honest as they come." I looked Barnes Jr. straight in the eye. "He's still alive?" "Yes, sir. Retired now, but still sharp." "I'd like to talk to him before I sign anything. Professional courtesy, you understand?" Frank's face went tight. "Dad, that's not necessary. Mitchell here is perfectly qualified." "I'm sure he is, but I'm an old railroad man, and we believe in double-checking the signals before we proceed down the track." Barnes looked uncomfortable for the first time since we'd walked in. "Mr. Jennings, while I appreciate your caution, these documents are fairly standard. Perhaps we could table this for now," I said, standing up. "I'll be in touch." The ride home was quiet as a funeral parlor. Frank gripped the steering wheel like he was trying to strangle it, and I could feel his frustration radiating off him like heat from a locomotive boiler. When we got to the house, he went straight to his room, my room, and started making phone calls with the door closed. That evening, Lily came home from school looking upset. She found me in the kitchen, where I was making a sandwich for dinner since Cheryl had announced they were eating out, and didn't ask if I wanted to come along. "Grandpa, Mom's really mad at me," she said, slumping into a chair at the table. "What about, honey?" "She says I've been filling your head with suspicions, that I'm causing trouble for the family." Lily's eyes filled with tears. "She says if I keep interfering with their plans to help you, they might have to find somewhere else for me to live." That hit me like a runaway freight car. "She said that?" "She says I don't understand adult responsibilities, that you need protection from yourself, and I'm too young to see it." Lily wiped her eyes. "But Grandpa, I found more papers. They're not just planning to control your money. There's something about selling the house, too." My hands went still on my sandwich. "What kind of papers?" "It looked like a will, but it wasn't your handwriting, and it left everything to Mom, everything." Her voice dropped to a whisper. and there was a letter to some nursing home about admissions procedures. Right then, I understood what was happening with crystal clarity. This wasn't about helping me or protecting me, or keeping me company. This was about taking everything I'd worked for and built over 4 decades, and transferring it to people who hadn't earned it. People who thought I was too old and stupid to notice. I'd seen this play before, back when the railroad was cutting jobs and forcing early retirements. They'd bring in the young executives with their briefcases and their smooth talk about restructuring and efficiency improvements. But what they really meant was taking everything that belonged to the workers and giving it to people who'd never turned a wrench or pulled a shift or earned an honest dollar in their lives. "Lily," I said quietly, "how much do you trust your old grandpa?" "More than anyone else in the world." "Then listen to me carefully. Tomorrow's Tuesday. Your parents both work during the day, right?" "Yes, sir." "I need you to do something important for me. Something that might save both of us." She leaned forward, and I saw that same determined look Margaret used to get when she was facing down a challenge. "What do you need me to do?" But before I could answer, we heard Frank's heavy footsteps in the hallway. Lily quickly wiped her eyes and pretended to be looking at homework, while I went back to making my sandwich. "Walt," Frank said from the doorway, "we need to talk. I just got off the phone with Mitchell Barnes. He says you're having second thoughts about protecting your assets." I looked at him steadily. "I'm having second thoughts about a lot of things, Frank." That night, lying in Margaret's sewing room, I heard them talking again through the walls. This time their voices were more urgent, more frustrated. And this time I caught a few words that chilled me to the bone: stubborn, incompetent, and nursing home. When Lily knocked on my door the next morning before school, her eyes were red like she hadn't slept much either. "Grandpa," she whispered, "I think we need to call someone, tonight." I nodded. "Pack a small bag, honey. Just essentials. And don't let them see you do it." She squeezed my hand. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe while I figure out how to fight back." At 2:30 in the morning on Wednesday, I heard Lily's soft knock on my door. 3 quick taps, then 2, the signal we'd agreed on. My small duffel bag was already packed with essentials. Medications, important papers I'd kept hidden in an old railroad manual, and enough clothes for a few days. Amazing how little a man really needs when he's running for his life. Lily appeared in the doorway like a ghost, carrying her school backpack and moving quieter than morning fog. Her face was pale but determined. Every bit Margaret's granddaughter when courage was called for. "You sure about this, honey?" I whispered. "Surer than I've ever been about anything, Grandpa." We crept through my own house like burglars, avoiding the floorboards I knew would creak. Frank's snoring carried through the thin walls of what used to be my bedroom, steady and oblivious. In the kitchen, I left a note on the table. "Gone to visit old friends for a few days. Don't worry, Walt." My 2010 Ford pickup started quiet as a church mouse. I'd maintained that truck like I used to maintain locomotive engines, regular service, quality parts. Everything checked and double-checked. It had never failed me, and it didn't fail me now when I needed it most. We drove through sleeping Shelby with the headlights off until we reached the main road, then headed south toward the old railroad camps where some of my buddies had retired. The roads were empty except for the occasional semi-truck heading toward Charlotte, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months: freedom. "Where exactly are we going?" Lily asked, as we turned onto Highway 18. "To see Joe Patterson. Worked with him for 22 years on the Southern Railway. Lives in a little trailer park about 15 miles south of town, near where the old Lattimore Depot used to be." Joe's place was a clean double-wide on 2 acres of land he'd bought when he retired in '89. He answered his door in long johns and a railroad cap, holding a baseball bat until he saw who was standing on his porch at 3 in the morning. "Walt Jennings, what in Sam Hill are you doing here at this hour?" "Joe, I need help. The kind of help that involves not asking too many questions right away." Joe looked at me, then at Lily, then back at me. We'd worked enough midnight emergencies together that he could read trouble in a man's face. "Come on in. Coffee's always ready." Sitting in Joe's kitchen while dawn broke over Cleveland County, I told him everything. The moving in, the power of attorney papers, Lily's discoveries, the whole sorry mess. Joe listened like he used to listen to radio dispatches. Complete attention, no interruptions. All business. Son of a bitch, he said when I finished. Your own daughter. Language, Joe, I said, nodding toward Lily. Hell, Walt, she's 17 and she's got more sense than the rest of your family combined. He refilled our coffee cups. What do you need? Place to stay for a few days while I sort this out. And maybe use of your phone. You got it. Lily can have the spare room, you can take the couch. It ain't fancy, but it's honest. By 7 a.m., my phone was ringing. Cheryl, probably having found my note. I let it ring. By 8 a.m., she'd called 6 times and left 3 voicemails that progressed from concerned to angry to panicked. At 9 a.m., I called my real lawyer, not that Barnes fellow, but Tom Richardson, who'd handled my property purchases and Margaret's estate. Richardson had been practicing law in Shelby since before Frank was born, and he knew where all the financial bodies were buried. Tom, it's Walt Jennings. I need to see you today. It's urgent. Walt, good to hear from you. What's the problem? I gave him the short version. Can you meet me somewhere private? Come to my house. 1 o'clock. And Walt, don't tell anyone where you're going. Richardson lived in a nice brick home on Piedmont Street, the kind of solid, respectable house that old money Shelby families preferred. His study was lined with law books and local history, including a framed photograph of the old Southern Railway depot downtown. Walt, I'm glad you called me, he said after I'd explained the situation again. That Barnes boy has been making inquiries about your property holdings, said he was representing the family in some estate planning matter. What kind of inquiries? Property valuations, tax assessments, lien searches, the kind of research you do before major transactions. Richardson leaned back in his chair. Walt, did you ever execute that trust document we discussed after Margaret passed? I smiled for the first time in weeks. Tom, you know me better than that. I may be old, but I'm not stupid. The Charles Morrison Trust? Fully executed and funded. Charles has been trustee for 3 years now. Richardson grinned like a man who'd just seen an ace up his sleeve. Well, I'll be damned. You old railroad dog, you actually listened to legal advice? Charles Morrison had been my bunkmate in Korea, my best man at my wedding, and the closest thing to a brother I'd ever had. When he retired from his accounting practice in Charlotte, I'd asked him to serve as trustee for the bulk of my assets. The house on Lineberger Street was still in my name, but the rental properties, most of my investments, and my life insurance were all protected in an irrevocable trust. So if someone got power of attorney over me, I asked, they'd control your personal checking account and maybe the house, but the trust assets, those belong to the trust, not to you personally. I called Charles from Richardson's phone. He answered on the first ring like he'd been waiting for my call. Walt, I was wondering when you'd contact me. I got an interesting call yesterday from some fellow claiming to represent your family. Wanted information about your financial situation. What did you tell him? I told him to go climb a tree. Then I started making some phone calls of my own. Charles' voice had an edge to it that I remembered from our army days. Walt, are you ready to fight back? I've been ready, Charles. I was just waiting for the right moment. Well, the moment's here. I've been doing some research on your son-in-law and your daughter's recent financial activities. We need to talk, tonight. Charles Morrison arrived at Joe's place Thursday evening driving the same Ford F-150 he'd owned for 15 years, looking every bit the retired Army sergeant and certified public accountant that had made him successful in Charlotte's business community. At 79, he was still sharp as a new rail spike and twice as tough. Walt, you look like hell, he said, giving me the kind of handshake that could crack walnuts. Feel worse than I look, Charles, but I'm ready to do something about it. We sat around Joe's kitchen table while Charles spread out a manila folder full of documents that made my situation crystal clear. Bank records, property searches, credit reports, the kind of financial intelligence that only a man with 40 years of accounting experience and old military connections could assemble in 2 days. Your daughter and son-in-law are in worse financial trouble than you probably realize, Charles began. Frank's real estate business owes $47,000 in back taxes, and they're 3 months behind on their mortgage. Cheryl's been borrowing against her 401k to cover basic expenses. How'd you find all this out? Joe asked. When you've been doing accounting as long as I have, you develop resources. And when you've served with Walt Jennings in Korea, you use those resources to protect your friends. Lily, who'd been quiet up until then, leaned forward. What about the nursing home papers I found? Charles pulled out another document. Sunset Manor, over in Forest City. They filed an inquiry about admission procedures for elderly residents with dementia or cognitive decline. The inquiry came from Frank's office. That hit me like a locomotive to the chest. They were planning to have me declared incompetent. That would be my guess. Get power of attorney, liquidate your visible assets, then warehouse you where you couldn't interfere with their spending. Joe slammed his coffee cup down hard enough to rattle the table. Goddamn thieves is what they are. The question is, what do we do about it? I asked. Charles smiled the way he used to smile before we went on patrol in Korea. We fight back, but we fight smart, using every advantage we have. Over the next 2 hours, Charles outlined a strategy that reminded me why he'd been the best soldier in our unit and the most successful businessman in Charlotte. We were going to use my connections, his expertise, and the fundamental truth that honest men with long memories could outmaneuver greedy people who thought they were smarter than everyone else. Friday morning, I started making phone calls. 43 years with the railroad and 15 years of running rental properties had given me a network that stretched from Asheville to Charlotte. First call was to Bobby Henderson, who'd been my union shop steward for 12 years and was now retired but still active with the Brotherhood of Railway Carmen. Walt Jennings, I heard through the grapevine you were having some family troubles. Word travels fast in railroad communities, especially when it involves one of their own being mistreated. Bobby listened to my story, then made his own calls. By lunchtime, I had offers of help from 3 retired engineers, 2 former conductors, and a brakeman who'd become a successful contractor in Charlotte. Next call was to my tenants. All 3 families who rented my properties had been with me for more than 5 years, and all 3 had stories about how I'd helped them through tough times by deferring rent or fixing problems out of my own pocket. When they heard what was happening, their response was immediate and heartfelt. Mr. Walt, said Teresa Martinez, who rented my property on South DeKalb Street, my husband and I owe you everything. You tell us what you need, and we'll do it. The third call was to someone Charles had suggested, a reporter named Susan Crawford, who worked for the Shelby Star and had a reputation for investigating elder abuse and financial fraud cases. Susan had grown up in Shelby and remembered when the railroad was the heart of the community. Mr. Jennings, I'd very much like to hear your story. This kind of family financial abuse is more common than people realize, and seniors need to see that they can fight back. We arranged to meet Saturday morning at Richardson's law office, where everything would be properly documented and legally protected. That evening, Lily helped me organize all the evidence we'd collected, photos of the forged documents she'd found, copies of Frank's financial records that Charles had obtained, witness statements from people who'd heard them talking about my situation. Grandpa, she said while we worked, I'm scared about what happens when this gets out. Mom's going to be furious with me. Honey, sometimes doing the right thing means standing up to people you love, even when it's hard. Your grandmother Margaret taught me that lesson more than once. What would she say about all this? I thought about Margaret, who'd stood up to bank officers and insurance agents, and anyone else who tried to take advantage of working people. She'd say that thieves are thieves, whether they're family or strangers. And she'd say that a man who won't fight for what he earned doesn't deserve to keep it. Saturday morning, Charles arrived with news that changed everything. Walt, remember that land you bought out near the old Boiling Springs Depot in 1983? The 12 acres? Yeah, I was going to build rental houses on it, but never got around to it. Well, it's worth about $700,000 now. The county's been looking for land for a new public works facility, and your tract is exactly what they need. Joe whistled low. That's more money than most folks see in a lifetime. Here's the interesting part, Charles continued. According to the property records, Frank's been making inquiries about that land too, asking about development potential, zoning restrictions, that sort of thing. I felt that familiar cold anger settling in my chest, the same feeling I used to get when I caught someone stealing tools from the railroad shop. They knew about the land. They knew about everything, Walt. They've been researching your assets for months, probably since before they moved in with you. Right then, Susan Crawford's car pulled into Joe's driveway. Through the window, I could see she had a photographer with her. "Gentlemen," I said, standing up and straightening my shoulders, "it's time to tell Shelby the truth about what happens when family forgets what family means." As Susan knocked on the door, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Jennings? This is Detective Maria Santos with the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office. We understand you might have information about a case we're investigating." Detective Santos arrived at Joe's place 20 minutes after Susan Crawford finished her interview, and she brought news that made my blood boil hotter than a locomotive firebox in August. A plainclothes officer in her 40s with the kind of steady eyes I'd learned to respect during my railroad years. She spread documents across Joe's kitchen table that told a story of betrayal deeper than I'd imagined. "Mr. Jennings, 3 days ago we received a complaint about possible elder financial abuse. Someone filed a quit-claim deed on your property at 412 Lineberger Street, transferring ownership to your daughter Cheryl Jennings. The problem is, the signature doesn't match any of your official signatures on file with the county." I stared at the document, seeing my name forged in handwriting that looked nothing like my own railroad engineer's careful script. 43 years of signing work orders, safety reports, and union documents had given me a signature as distinctive as a thumbprint, and this wasn't it. "When was this filed?" I asked. "Tuesday morning, the day after your lawyer's appointment." Someone was in a hurry. Detective Santos pulled out another paper. "There's more. They also attempted to file a power of attorney document with the Register of Deeds, claiming you'd become incompetent due to advancing dementia." Charles Morrison examined the documents with his accountant's eye for detail. "This is sophisticated fraud. They knew exactly which forms to file and in what order to make it look legitimate." "The timing tells the story," Detective Santos continued. "File the power of attorney first, claiming incompetence. Then use that authority to transfer property ownership. If you hadn't disappeared when you did, they probably would have had you in a nursing home by the weekend." Lily looked pale as winter moonlight. "They really were going to lock him away?" "That appears to have been the plan. Take control of his assets, liquidate everything, then warehouse him where he couldn't cause problems." The detective's voice carried the disgust of someone who'd seen too much family greed in her career. I felt something cold and final settle in my chest, like the moment when you realize a train wreck is inevitable, and all you can do is minimize the damage. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about my daughter and son-in-law planning to steal my life, my freedom, and my dignity. "Detective Santos, what are my options?" "First, we file criminal charges for fraud, forgery, and attempted elder abuse. Second, you get a restraining order to keep them away from your property and your person. Third, you get your house back through the civil courts." Tom Richardson, who'd been listening from the corner, stepped forward. "I can have those papers filed within 2 hours. Walt, are you ready to make this official? I thought about Margaret, about 43 years of honest work, about the granddaughter sitting across from me who'd risked everything to help me escape. Some decisions make themselves. Let's do it." By Monday morning, the wheels of justice were grinding as steady as freight trains through the North Carolina foothills. Richardson filed fraud charges with the district attorney's office. Detective Santos executed a search warrant on my house, and I obtained a restraining order requiring Cheryl and Frank to stay at least 500 yards away from me and my property. The look on Frank's face when the sheriff's deputies arrived to serve the restraining order was apparently worth photographing, according to Susan Crawford, who happened to be across the street with her camera when it happened. That photograph made the front page of Wednesday's Shelby Star, right above the headline, "Local Veteran Fights Back Against Family Fraud." The story Susan wrote told the whole truth in the kind of clear, honest language that railroad men appreciate. She interviewed my tenants, my union buddies, and Joe Patterson, building a picture of a man who'd worked hard, lived honestly, and trusted the wrong people. But more importantly, she showed how I was fighting back. Walt Jennings represents something that's becoming rare in our community," she wrote, "a man who built his wealth through decades of honest labor, who treated his tenants fairly, and who expected his family to share his values of integrity and hard work. When that trust was betrayed, he didn't just accept it as inevitable, he fought back, proving that age doesn't have to mean powerlessness. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. My phone rang constantly with offers of help from people I hadn't spoken to in years. The Railroad Brotherhood organized a legal defense fund. Local businesses offered discounts and services. Even people I didn't know stopped by Joe's place to shake my hand and tell me they were proud of what I was doing. You're giving hope to a lot of old folks who thought they had no choice but to take whatever their families dished out, said Ruth Henderson, Bobby's wife, when she brought over a casserole Tuesday evening. But the most satisfying response came from an unexpected source. Thursday morning, I received a phone call from Colonel retired James McPherson, Director of the North Carolina Veterans Administration Legal Services. Codename Mr. Jennings, your case has come to our attention through official channels. As a veteran who served with distinction in Korea, you qualify for priority assistance in cases of elder abuse and fraud. We'd like to assign one of our staff attorneys to work with your private counsel. My military service had been 58 years ago, but apparently the United States Army doesn't forget its own. Within 24 hours, I had a full-time VA attorney, a paralegal, and access to federal resources for prosecuting elder abuse cases. Walt, Charles said Friday evening as we reviewed our legal strategy, they picked the wrong old soldier to mess with. The breakthrough came Saturday morning, when Detective Santos called with news that changed everything. Mr. Jennings, we found something during our search of your house. Hidden in Frank's briefcase were preliminary agreements with developers interested in your land near Boiling Springs. He'd been negotiating the sale of property he didn't own, taking deposits from buyers for fraudulent transactions. How much money? Nearly $200,000 in deposits from 3 different development companies. Money that's currently sitting in a bank account under Frank's name. This meant Frank wasn't just planning to steal my assets after gaining control. He was actively selling my property before he even had legal ownership. The federal charges alone could put him in prison for 10 years. Sunday afternoon, as I sat on Joe's front porch reading the latest newspaper coverage of my case, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. 2 people got out, a woman in a business suit, and a young man carrying a briefcase. Mr. Jennings? I'm Catherine Morrison from the North Carolina Senior Rights Legal Foundation. We'd like to offer you our full resources in pursuing this case. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 82 years, but also feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Power, the power that comes from being right, having allies, and refusing to go quietly into the night. Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but I think what I'd really like is to take this story public in a big way. Show other seniors that they don't have to be victims. She smiled. Mr. Jennings, we were hoping you'd say that. How would you feel about testifying before the North Carolina General Assembly about the need for stronger elder protection laws? I thought about Margaret, about Lily's courage, about all the honest railroad men who taught me that sometimes you have to make a stand. Ma'am, I'd be honored. Monday morning brought the kind of autumn weather that used to signal busy times on the railroad, crisp air, clear skies, and the promise that serious work was about to get done. I woke up in Joe's guest room feeling more like my old self than I had in months, knowing that today we'd be taking the fight directly to the people who'd tried to rob me blind. Tom Richardson called at 8 a.m. sharp, with news that made me smile for the first time since this whole mess started. Walt, the DA's office has agreed to fast-track the criminal charges. Grand jury meets Thursday, and they're confident about getting indictments for fraud, forgery, and elder financial abuse. But the real satisfaction came from the civil lawsuit we were filing that morning. Charles Morrison had worked through the weekend with the VA attorneys, assembling a case that would not only get my property back, but make Cheryl and Frank pay damages for their attempted theft. We're asking for triple damages under the elder abuse statutes, Richardson explained as we walked into the Cleveland County Courthouse. That means they'll owe you 3 times the value of everything they tried to steal, plus attorney fees, plus punitive damages for the emotional distress. The math was staggering. My house, the rental properties, the land near Boiling Springs, plus the money Frank had illegally collected from developers, total value approaching $1.4 million. Triple damages would bankrupt them completely, which seemed like appropriate justice for people who'd planned to leave me penniless in a nursing home. By noon, word of the lawsuit had reached Cheryl's workplace at Cleveland Regional Medical Center. The hospital administration, already nervous about the negative publicity surrounding one of their department heads, placed her on administrative leave pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. They can't afford to have someone charged with elder abuse in a supervisory position, explained Catherine Morrison from the Senior Rights Foundation. Hospital liability alone could be millions if patients' families start questioning whether their loved ones are safe under her care. Frank's situation was even worse. The North Carolina Real Estate Commission suspended his license the moment they learned about the criminal charges. Without his license, he couldn't legally conduct any real estate transactions, effectively ending his career and eliminating his income. These people thought they were so clever, Charles said, as we reviewed the day's developments over dinner at Joe's place. But they forgot that when you steal from someone with 43 years of union experience, you're not just fighting one old man, you're fighting an entire community. The community support had been overwhelming. The Brotherhood of Railway Carmen established a legal defense fund that raised $12,000 in 3 days. Local businesses donated services. Joe's Automotive fixed my truck for free. Henderson's Grocery delivered food to Joe's place. And even Dr. Patterson at the medical clinic offered free health care for the duration of the legal proceedings. "It's not about the money," explained Bobby Henderson when he stopped by with the latest fundraising totals. "It's about showing that Shelby takes care of its own, and we don't tolerate family members who prey on their elders." Wednesday evening brought the most satisfying moment yet. Susan Crawford called with news that the story had been picked up by the Charlotte Observer and was generating statewide attention. "Walt, you've become a symbol. Other seniors are coming forward with similar stories. Law enforcement agencies are reopening cold cases, and the legislature is talking about strengthening elder protection laws." But the real vindication came Thursday afternoon, when Detective Santos called with an update on the criminal investigation. "Mr. Jennings, the grand jury handed down indictments on all charges. Your daughter and son-in-law have been arrested and are currently being processed for booking." I sat in Joe's kitchen, holding the phone and feeling something I hadn't experienced since Margaret died. Complete satisfaction in a job well done. They tried to destroy me, and instead they destroyed themselves. Friday morning, their attorney, a different lawyer than the Barnes fellow who'd tried to pressure me into signing papers, called with a settlement offer. "Mr. Jennings, my clients are prepared to make full restitution and agreed to permanent restraining orders in exchange for dropping the criminal charges." I didn't even have to think about it. "Counselor, they made their choice when they forged my signature and planned to warehouse me in a nursing home. They can explain their actions to a jury." That same afternoon, I made a decision that felt like the most important thing I'd done since enlisting in the Army in 1952. I called Catherine Morrison and told her I wanted to donate a significant portion of my Boiling Springs land to establish a community center focused on elder protection and advocacy. We could build a facility that provides legal services, financial counseling, and support groups for seniors facing family abuse. I explained, "Make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to others." "Mr. Jennings, that's incredibly generous. But are you sure that land is worth—" "I'm sure. Money you can't take with you isn't worth much, but a legacy that helps other people last forever." The announcement of the donation made front-page news in both the Shelby Star and the Charlotte Observer. More importantly, it seemed to crystallize public opinion about what this case really represented. "Walt Jennings isn't just fighting for his own rights," wrote Susan Crawford in her follow-up story. "He's fighting for the principle that our elders deserve respect, protection, and dignity." His decision to donate valuable land for community service shows the difference between people who build communities and people who just take from them. Saturday evening, as Lily and I sat on Joe's front porch watching the sunset, she asked the question that had been weighing on both our minds. "Grandpa, do you think Mom will ever understand why we had to do this?" I thought about that for a long time, watching the last light fade over the North Carolina foothills where I'd spent my whole life. "Honey," Some people learn lessons from consequences, and some people just get angry when their plans don't work. Your mother, well, we'll find out which kind she is. What happens to us now? Now we go to court, we tell the truth, and we let 12 honest citizens decide what justice looks like. But as I said those words, my phone rang with news that would make the whole legal process much more interesting. Mr. Jennings, this is Judge Patricia Williams' clerk. The judge would like to meet with all parties in chambers Monday morning at 9 a.m. She has some questions about the settlement discussions. Judge Patricia Williams had a reputation in Cleveland County for running an efficient courtroom and having no patience for lawyers who wasted time or families who used the legal system to settle personal grudges. At 68, she was old enough to understand the dynamics of elder abuse, but young enough to appreciate the courage it took for someone like Lily to stand up to her own parents. The meeting in her chambers Monday morning felt like a railroad arbitration hearing, formal, serious, and focused on facts rather than emotions. Cheryl and Frank sat with their attorney on one side of the conference table, looking like people who'd finally realized they were in deeper trouble than they'd imagined. Tom Richardson, the VA attorney, and I sat on the other side, with Lily beside me in her best dress, and the kind of serious expression that reminded me painfully of Margaret during difficult conversations. Miss Jennings, Judge Williams addressed Lily directly. You understand that anything you say here today is under oath and will be part of the official court record? Yes, ma'am. I understand. Tell me, in your own words, what you observed in your grandfather's house during the time your parents lived there. For the next 20 minutes, Lily spoke with a clarity and maturity that made me proud to be her grandfather. She described finding the forged power of attorney documents, overhearing conversations about nursing homes and asset liquidation, and witnessing the gradual isolation and intimidation tactics her parents had used against me. The night before we left, I heard Mom and Dad talking about how Grandpa was becoming a problem and needed to be handled more decisively. Lily testified. Dad said something about having to speed up their timeline because Grandpa was asking too many questions. Judge Williams looked directly at Cheryl. Mrs. Jennings, do you have any response to your daughter's testimony? Cheryl's face was red with anger and embarrassment. Your Honor, Lily has been turned against us by people who don't understand our family dynamics. We were trying to help my father, and she's too young to understand adult financial responsibilities. I see. The judge turned back to Lily. Miss Jennings, how do you respond to your mother's characterization? Lily looked at her mother with an expression that seemed far older than her 17 years. Mom, I understand more than you think I do. I understand that Grandpa worked for 43 years to build something honest, and you and Dad tried to take it away from him. I understand that you were going to put him in a nursing home, not because he needed care, but because he was inconvenient to your plans. The silence in the judge's chambers was broken only by the sound of Frank shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Judge Williams consulted her notes. Mr. Jennings, I understand you have something you'd like to present to the court regarding your granddaughter's future. This was the moment I'd been preparing for since the legal proceedings began. I pulled out documents that Charles Morrison had helped me prepare, legally complex papers that represented something simple: love and faith in the next generation. Your Honor, I'm establishing an irrevocable educational trust fund for Lily Jennings, funded with $150,000 from my assets, specifically designated for her college education and graduate school expenses. I looked at my granddaughter, whose eyes were filling with tears. She's earned it by being the only member of my family who put my welfare before her own interests. Grandpa, you don't have to. Honey, this isn't charity. This is investment in someone who proved she has the courage to do what's right, even when it's hard. Cheryl's attorney leaned forward. Your Honor, my client objects to this trust arrangement being discussed in these proceedings. It appears to be designed to punish. Judge Williams held up her hand. Counselor, Mr. Jennings is free to dispose of his assets as he sees fit, particularly in favor of family members who have acted in his best interests. She turned to Lily. Miss Jennings, do you accept this trust arrangement? Lily looked at me with Margaret's eyes, full of gratitude and understanding. Yes, ma'am, I do, and I promise to use it to become the kind of person who helps other families avoid what happened to ours. The judge made some notes, then addressed the room generally. I want to share something with all of you. In my 15 years on the bench, I've presided over dozens of elder abuse cases. What makes this case unusual is not the attempted fraud. Sadly, that's common. What's unusual is having a teenage family member with the moral courage to protect her grandfather at considerable personal cost. She looked directly at Cheryl and Frank. Your daughter has shown more integrity in this situation than both of you combined. I suggest you think carefully about that. After the hearing, Lily and I walked through downtown Shelby toward Tom Richardson's office to finalize the trust paperwork. The October air was crisp and clean, reminding me of autumn days when Margaret and I used to take walks through these same streets, planning our future and building our life together. Grandpa, I need to tell you something, Lily said as we paused at the corner where the old Southern Railway depot used to stand. I kept a journal during the time Mom and Dad lived with you. Every conversation I overheard, every document I found, every threat or manipulation I witnessed, everything's written down with dates and times. Why didn't you tell me about this before? Because I wanted to make sure it could help you before I revealed it. Tom Richardson says it's admissible evidence because I witnessed everything firsthand. I stopped walking and looked at this remarkable young woman who carried her grandmother's courage and her grandfather's strategic thinking. Lily, do you understand what this means for the case? It means they're going to prison, doesn't it? It means justice is going to be served, exactly the way it should be. That evening, back at Joe's place, I called Tom Richardson with the news about Lily's journal. His response was immediate and enthusiastic. Walt, this is the evidence we needed to make the criminal case airtight. With contemporaneous notes from a credible witness who was present for the entire conspiracy, the DA can prosecute this as organized elder abuse rather than simple fraud. What's the difference? About 5 to 10 years in prison and permanent prohibition from working in healthcare or financial services. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Lily had given me something more valuable than evidence. She'd given me the proof that integrity and courage still existed in the next generation, and that the values Margaret and I had tried to live by weren't lost forever. Wednesday morning, Judge Williams' clerk called with news that would determine how this whole story ended. Mr. Jennings, the judge has scheduled final hearings for next Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. She says she's ready to render her decision on all matters. Tuesday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of November weather that used to signal the end of harvest season, when I was young, and the beginning of winter work on the railroad. I woke up in Joe's guest room feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Complete peace with whatever was about to happen. The truth was told, the evidence was presented, and 12 honest citizens would decide what justice looked like. The Cleveland County Courthouse was busier than usual, with news reporters from Charlotte and Asheville joining Susan Crawford in covering what had become a statewide story about elder abuse and family courage. I walked through the crowd wearing my best suit, the one Margaret had helped me pick out for Lily's confirmation 3 years ago, feeling every bit the retired railroad engineer who'd earned his place in this community through 4 decades of honest work. Judge Williams took the bench at precisely 10 a.m. and immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the courtroom. At 68, she carried the authority of someone who'd seen enough human nature to be surprised by very little, but who still believed that justice was worth pursuing. In the matter of the state of North Carolina versus Cheryl Jennings and Franklin Morrison, and in the related civil matter of Walter Jennings versus the same defendants, this court has reached its decisions. The next 10 minutes felt like the longest 10 minutes of my life, longer than waiting for train schedules during emergency repairs, longer than sitting in Margaret's hospital room during her final illness, on the criminal charges of elder fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit financial abuse. This court finds both defendants guilty on all counts. Judge Williams' voice carried across the silent courtroom like a train whistle through mountain valleys. The evidence presented, particularly the testimony and documentation provided by Miss Lily Jennings, demonstrates a calculated and systematic attempt to defraud an elderly family member of his life's savings and assets. I felt Lily's hand squeeze mine as we sat in the front row, both of us understanding that this moment represented more than just legal victory. It represented the triumph of truth over deception, courage over intimidation. Furthermore, the judge continued, The attempted use of forged power of attorney documents to gain control of Mr. Walter Jennings' assets, followed by the premeditated plan to place him in institutional care against his will, represents elder abuse in its most calculated and heartless form. Cheryl was crying quietly at the defendant's table, but I couldn't tell if the tears represented remorse for what she'd done, or just regret for getting caught. Frank sat stone-faced, probably calculating lawyers' fees and prison sentences. On the civil matters, this court orders the immediate return of all property illegally transferred, plus damages in the amount of $1.4 million, representing triple damages under North Carolina's elder protection statutes. The financial judgment was more than I'd expected, and more than they could possibly pay, which meant they'd be declaring bankruptcy and losing everything: house, cars, savings, professional licenses, everything they'd tried to steal from me. For sentencing on the criminal matters, Mrs. Jennings will serve 18 months in the North Carolina Department of Corrections, followed by 3 years supervised probation and 500 hours of community service, specifically working with elderly residents in supervised care facilities. I thought about that. Cheryl, who'd planned to warehouse me in a nursing home, would spend the next 4 years working with the very people she'd tried to exploit. There was justice in that irony that even Margaret would have appreciated. Mr. Morrison will serve 36 months in state prison, followed by 5 years supervised probation and permanent prohibition from working in real estate, financial services, or any profession involving the handling of others' assets. Frank's sentence was harsher because he'd been the mastermind, the one who'd researched the legal procedures and orchestrated the fraud. He'd also collected nearly $200,000 from developers for land he didn't own, which made his crimes felonies rather than misdemeanors. As the court session ended and reporters crowded around asking for statements, I found myself thinking about something larger than personal vindication. This case had become a symbol for other seniors facing similar abuse, and my response had to reflect that responsibility. What I want people to understand, I told Susan Crawford during the interview afterward, is that being old doesn't mean being helpless. We built this country with our hands and our work, and we deserve to enjoy the fruits of that labor in safety and dignity. Wednesday afternoon, the Shelby Rotary Club asked me to speak at their weekly meeting about elder rights and community responsibility. Standing at that podium, looking out at business leaders and community figures I'd known for decades, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my railroad retirement: the satisfaction of useful work. 43 years ago, I started working for the Southern Railway because I believed in honest labor and fair wages, I told the group. Today, I want to work for something else, making sure no senior citizen in Cleveland County ever faces alone what I faced with family members who forgot what family means. The response was immediate and overwhelming. 3 local attorneys volunteered to provide free legal services for elder abuse cases. The hospital offered to fund support groups. Even the sheriff's department committed to specialized training for investigating financial crimes against seniors. Thursday evening, I received a phone call that represented the kind of recognition I'd never expected. Mr. Jennings, this is Dr. Sarah Mitchell from Western Carolina University. We'd like to establish a scholarship in your name for students studying social work with a focus on elder advocacy. I thought about Lily, about her courage and integrity, about Margaret's belief that education was the key to improving people's lives. Dr. Mitchell, I'd be honored, but I have one condition. What's that? The first scholarship recipient should be my granddaughter, Lily Jennings. She's earned it. Friday morning brought news that Frank had filed for divorce from Cheryl, trying to escape the financial judgment by claiming he'd been coerced into the fraud scheme. Even facing prison, he was still trying to manipulate the system and avoid responsibility. But I'd stopped caring about Frank's schemes or Cheryl's tears. Justice had been served, the community had rallied around what was right, and I had work to do helping other seniors avoid the betrayal I'd experienced. Saturday evening, as Lily and I sat on Joe's front porch planning her college applications, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Mr. Jennings? This is Chancellor Roberts from Appalachian State University. We understand you might be interested in helping us develop a new program for elder advocacy and protection. 6 months after Judge Williams handed down her verdict, I stood in the doorway of my renovated cottage on the back portion of my Boiling Springs property, watching the sunrise paint the North Carolina foothills the color of old copper. The cottage was small, just 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room. But it was exactly what I needed at 82, manageable, comfortable, and surrounded by 12 acres of land that would soon become the Walter and Margaret Jennings Community Center for Elder Advocacy. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd ended up downsizing after all. Just not the way Cheryl and Frank had planned. The difference was that I'd chosen this life rather than having it forced on me, and that made all the difference in the world.